Greetings and welcome to the Wild Swans at Coole. Today's video is on T.S. Eliot's famous essay, The Metaphysical Poets. In this video, we are going to discuss about how does T.S. Eliot establish that the metaphysical poets belong to the main current of English literature. In the previous video on T.S. Eliot's essay, we have discussed the features of metaphysical poets according to Eliot. But in this video, we are going to see that how Eliot has established that metaphysical poets are not different than other poets. That in the previous video we have discussed that how metaphysical poets differ from other poets. But in this video, we are going to discuss that how metaphysical poets, though their writing style, though because of their knowledge, because of their unification of senses, unification of sensibility, they belong. Though they differ from other poets, but still they belong to the main current of English literature. How they are still are part of other poets of English literature. How they can be still read. How we still read as a poet, and how we should not be prejudice them as metaphysical poets. Though the term metaphysical make them differ from other poets, but still they are part of English literature poets. So let's begin. Eliot's essay on the English metaphysical poets was originally published in the Times Literary Supplement as a review of a just published selection of their poetry by the scholar Herbert J.C. Grierson titled Metaphysical Lyrics and Poems of the 17th Century done to Butler. So this essay by Eliot was not actually an essay but a review of Herbert J.C. Grierson's famous book on metaphysical lyrics and poems of 17th century done to Butler. This is the title of the book. Now, what does Eliot does in the review or in this essay? Eliot has drawn a distinct picture of intellectual poets and reflective poets through their use of unification of sensibility and dissociation of sensibility. So, Eliot has divided his poets in two groups. One is intellectual and the other is reflective poet. So, and how he differs them? He differs them through the use of their sensibility. Now, what is sensibility? Sensibility is a term that Eliot used, and this term actually referred that sensibility is a faculty. By sensibility, Eliot means a faculty which can amalgamate and unite thought and feeling, right? This line. So, by sensibility, Eliot means feeling or the capacity to receive senses. So, this is the general definition of sensibility, that the capacity of receiving senses. But Eliot says that sensibility is a synthetic faculty, a faculty which can amalgamate and unite thought and feeling, and which can fuse the varied and disparate into a single whole, which are often opposite and contradictory experiences. So, according to Eliot, sensibility is a mixture of thought and feeling. And what kind of thought and feeling? That are two completely different things, opposite and contradictory experiences. But in the previous video, we have discussed that metaphysical poets use conceit, and because of that conceit, they can unify two different things. And the sensibility, unification of sensibility is done by the use of this conceit. They make a single whole out of two different and opposite and contradictory experiences. This is the quality of metaphysical poets. He discussed what would have been the fate of the metaphysical had the current of poetry descended in a direct line from them as it is descended in a direct line to them. Eliot is asking the question that what will be the fate of the metaphysical poets if the main current of English literature means Milton, Shakespeare, Dryden, then Tennyson, Browning, then modern poets, and metaphysical poets get detached from that line. What will be their fate? And how? And after raising this question, he is establishing that no, this will not happen, because metaphysical are by no means are different from other poets. Other poetry descended in a direct line from them, not in a direct line to them. Eliot is also saying that Tennyson and Browning, they have differed from unification of sensibility. When they thought or when they think, they only think, or when they feel, they only feel. So, and Milton and Dryden, their experiences are also similar. But in Milton and Dryden case, there is more feeling. But for Tennyson and Browning case, there is more thoughts. Or in Milton and Dryden, there is no unification. There is, or something is greater than something. Thought is greater than feeling. Or for the case of Tennyson and Browning also, one is greater than other. But for the metaphysicals, both things are allying side by side. Poets of 17th century, the successors of the dramatists of 16th century. So the poets of 17th century are the successor of the dramatists of 16th century, right? So they possess, the poets of 17th century possess a mechanism of sensibility which can devour any kind of experience. That means the poets of 17th centuries has some mechanism of sensibility, and because of this mechanism of sensibility, mechanism means the instrument, right? So they are using sensibility as an instrument, and because of this instrument, they can consume any kind of experiences. So whether it is reading a book or cooking or typewriting, so they can easily make two things one, as if they are very similar. So it is their because of their power of sensibility through the use of metaphysics, conceit, etc. They are simple, artificial, difficult and fantastic, like their predecessors. Predecessors mean the poets of 16th century. So they are, so these metaphysical poets are similar to the dramatists of 16th century. The way they write, their mode of feeling is directly and freshly altered by their reading and thought. But though they are the direct predecessors of 16th century dramatists or writers, but their mode of feeling is very much affected by what kind of book they read or how the way they think. In the dramatist Chapman, for example, there is a direct sensuous apprehension of thought or a reaction of thought. So in the dramatist, in the 16th century dramatist Chapman, there is a direct apprehension or of thought or reaction of thought into feeling. So in the writing of Chapman, when you read his text, Chapman's text, you will realize that there is a certain kind of tendency of thought. Though he is describing a feeling, but there is certain kind of thought. And this same apprehension means anxiousness. So there is an anxiety of thought in the feeling of Chapman, and this anxiety of thought or that feeling and thought simultaneously side by side is similar to Donne, to the poetry of Donne. So the poetry of Donne is closer to Chapman. For Donne, thought is an experience. So for Donne, thought is not different than other senses, or thought is part of the senses. For Donne, thought is an experience because it modifies sensibility, because it helps him affect his sensibility, his feelings, because thought is part of his feeling. For Donne, metaphysical poets like Donne, Herbert, Coole, they are able to think and feel at the same time. They feel their thought like the odor of a rose. So when you are smelling a rose, right, so at the same time you are seeing the rose and you are also smelling it. Similarly, the metaphysical poets, they are also feeling at the same time thinking. So this is a metaphor used by Eliot, that metaphysical poets feel their thought like the odor of a rose. That great Elizabethans and early Jacobeans have developed a unified sensibility which is expressed in their poetry. So in the great Elizabethans and the early Jacobean poets, there is the mixing or the unification of thought and feeling in their poetry. By sensibility, you know, we have discussed that in the previous part, that by sensibility, Eliot does not mean feeling or the capacity to receive sense. By sensibility, he means a faculty which can amalgamate or mix and unite thought and feeling, which can fuse the varied and disparate into a single whole, which are often opposite and contradictory experiences. So by the Elizabethans had such kind of sensibility, unified sensibility. So you can see that the Elizabethans have unified sensibility. Now the metaphysical also have unified sensibility. So there is no much difference. So the line of poetry is continuing from Elizabethan to metaphysical poets. So they are by no means they are different or get separated from the main current. So they are in the main current, right? So they are widely read, means the Elizabethans are widely read, and when they think on what they did, their thinking and learning modify their mode of feeling. So Elizabethans thinking and learning also develop their feelings. So their feelings are not only based on external experiences, their thinking, their feeling is also based on their intellectual ability, their cognitive ability. Eliot gives concrete illustration to show that such unification of sensibility, fusion of thought and feeling, is to be found in the poetry of Donne, Herbert, Cowley, Vaughan. So that sensibility, the kind of sensibility that Elizabethan has, the same kind of sensibility of fusion of thought and feeling is found in Donne, Herbert, Cowley and Vaughan's poetry. But it lacks in the poetry of Tennyson and Browning and other romantic poets. So Eliot is trying to establish that Elizabethans, then or the early Jacobeans and metaphysical, they are similar, but Tennyson, Browning, romantic poets, they differ from them. So Eliot is trying to establish metaphysical poets in the current of English poetry, but also he is also de-establishing romantic and Tennyson and Browning. How? The Tennyson and Browning are poets, they think, but they do not feel their thought as immediately as the odor of a rose like the metaphysical poets. So when Tennyson is thinking or writing a poetry, or when he is feeling and writing a poetry, he is one thing, or there is no mixing, there is always a obsessive of thought or obsessive of feeling. But in the romantics there is obsessive feeling, right? If you read Keats, if you read William Wordsworth, you will realize, or if you read Ozymandias by Shelley, there is always obsessiveness of thought or obsessiveness of feeling. But in the case of metaphysics, in the case of Elizabethan, there is not that obsessiveness. There is only the fusion or the mixing of unifying of thought and feeling. So the unification of sensibility is present in the metaphysical poets as a result of the continuation of dissociation of sensibility. So the dissociation of sensibility happens. How? The dissociation of sensibility happens from Tennyson, Browning, romantic poets, Tennyson, then Browning, then the poetic language in Milton and Dryden become more refined, but unfortunately the feeling become more crude. So in the case of Milton and Dryden, the dissociation of sensibility happens, because Dryden's writing is a very satirical. So Milton and Dryden, there is the poetic language is good in the case of Milton and Dryden, but there is unfortunately the feeling becomes very simple. For instance, the feeling expresses in Gray's Elegy is cruder than that in the Coy Mysteries of Andrew Marvell. So Andrew Marvell, who is a metaphysical poet, the way he uses feeling and thought or feeling is more critical or more artificial than Thomas Gray's Elegy written in a country church. So again, Thomas Gray differs from the Elizabethans or from the early Jacobeans or the predecessors of the 16th century dramatists. Another effect of the dissociation shown by Milton and Dryden is the appearance of sentimentalism in poetry and a struggle towards unification of sensibility. So another dissociation by Milton is Dryden. So one dissociation by Milton and Dryden, according to Eliot, is shown by their use of feeling, because the way they use feeling, the feeling becomes very simple. And then another struggle is the appearance of sentimentalism in poetry. So that way they use sentimentalism, it makes thought and it does not fusion thought and feeling. And the struggle towards unification of sensibility is also shown in some great poets like Shelley, because who seems to think and feel unbalanced, according to Eliot. So Eliot has also pointed out that Shelley is also someone who have struggled towards unification of sensibility, because his thinking and feeling is unbalanced, not balanced like other metaphysical poets. The sentimental age began early in the 18th century and continued. So the poets of 18th century, they have revolted against the rational or descriptive type. They have refused thought and accepted feeling, and because of that, no unification of sensibility happens. But in the case of Elizabethans, in the case of 16th century dramatists, in the case of early Jacobeans, in the case of metaphysical poets, unification of sensibility continues. But after that, Milton, Dryden, then Tennyson, Browning, and then romantics, then transitional poets, the dissociation continued. So in the other words, Donne and the other metaphysicals are in the direct current of English poetry, and the modern poets are their direct descendants. So Eliot is saying that Donne and the metaphysicals are in the direct current of English poetry, and the modern poets are their direct descendants. Eliot is saying that Donne and other metaphysical poets and their descendants, modern poets, they have used unification of sensibility. This current flows direct from the Elizabethan age rightly up to the modern age, but only in the middle that Milton, Dryden, Tennyson, Browning, romantic poets, transitional poets like Gray, they have differed. They do not continue the feeling, thought, unification of thought and feeling. So only and unfortunately this continuity is broken for some time under the influence of Milton and Dryden. The poet has different faculties and sensibilities. He must achieve a unification of his sensibilities and must express these unified sensibilities in his poetry. So according to Eliot, a poet may have different faculties, may have different sensibility, but he have to try to achieve the unification of sensibility, and he must express, according to Eliot, this unification sensibility in a poetry, and only then a poetry will be complete. Unless, if you, according to Eliot, if you do not use unification of thought and feeling, then the poetry will be complex and difficult. So Eliot is trying to establish a kind of set boundary of poetry. Metaphysics and moderns have this complexity, this completeness and maturity. And if we judge them by adopting the opposite method, we will see that, like for example, we are judging from Elizabethans, but if we judge from reverse, like from modern to Elizabethan, then we will see that the poets of the 17th century has a direct and normal development with the precedent age. We will see that it is the only, so Eliot is telling us to see from the opposite, like from the reverse, from modern to Elizabethan, and then we will see that the metaphysics actually belong from the main current, and it is and as he says that it is that the current of poetry descended in a direct line from them, not a direct line to them. And we will see that it is Tennyson, Browning and romantic poets and other transitional poets who have differed from the main current, without prejudicing them by the adjective metaphysical. And if we do not call them metaphysical poets, if we only call them poets, then after the dissociation they put the material together again in a unity. Because if you see from the reverse, from modern age, you will see that Browning and Tennyson, there is overpower of thought, in romantics there is overpower of feeling, but then we will see that in metaphysical poets there is mixing of thought and feeling, then in early Jacobeans there is mixing of thought and feeling, then in the dramatists of 16th century there is mixing of thought and feeling, and then in the Elizabethans there is mixing of thought and feeling. So we will see that after the dissociation from down to up, so after the dissociation means how Tennyson, Browning and romantics have dissociated thought and feeling, but it is physics who have unified the thought and feeling, and then in a reverse way Elizabethans or the early Jacobeans or the 16th century dramatists are following the metaphysics. So this doesn't happen in reality, because it is only in theory. Eliot is trying to establish his point of view by telling us to look from, not from up to down, but from down to up. This doesn't happen in reality, that metaphysical poets does not influence Jacobeans. It is only Eliot is telling us to see in that way. And if we see in the reverse way, we will see that after the dissociation they put the material together again in a new unity. Means materials means the unit, thought and feeling. They put thought and feeling together again in a new unity. That is being differed, that is being separated by Tennyson poets like romantics poets like Tennyson and Browning poets like Milton and Dryden. In this way, metaphysical poets are the part of main current of English poetry. So Eliot is reversing the idea and trying to establish his point of view, because the truth is, it is at first Elizabethans, then metaphysicals, then Tennyson, Browning, then romantics, Tennyson, Browning, it's like this. But Eliot is telling us to view it from the downside up way, right? So that is it for today's video, guys. I have trying make it simple for you, because so that you can understand it, because if you understand it clearly, then you will be able to write in your own. And I will share the link of the essay in the description, and for a better understanding you can also watch the previous video, because these are the two questions. One is the features of metaphysical poetry according to Eliot, and the second is unification sensibility, or how the metaphysical poets belong from the main kind of English poetry. This is the two main topic, that is the main point of view of T.S. Eliot's famous essay, the metaphysical poets. That unification of sensibility is not a very difficult thing. It is just Eliot's point of view that he has expressed in a review of the book Herbert J.C. Grierson's that is being published in Times Literary Supplement.